All right. Glad I had the opportunity to try to do this on Monday, because I told everybody on Monday that I was very nervous because I don't understand a lot about this week's Parsha, because it has to do with Tuma and Tahara and purity and impurity and things, and when it comes to purity and impurities, it's a area where the explanation behind those things are sort of foggy. Sort of to give a brief idea on the concept of Tuma and Tahara, when it comes to, practically speaking, when I'm discussing Tuma and Tahara, like last night we were having a conversation in Daf Yomi about somebody who is Tameh, who eats Maser Sheni, which is supposed to be eaten in Yerushalayim, and whether he can be Tameh or whether that Maser. And there are people that are in this year that this is their one of their first experiences with a lot of halachos, and they're trying to figure out, like, okay, practically speaking, how does this Tuma and Tahara really impact me? And the answer is not that much. Most of, when it comes to Tuma and Tahara, purities and impurities, the practical ramifications have to do with being unable to go into certain places like where the Beis HaMikdash is, and it has to do with not eating certain holy items like tithes and also korbanos, but also in certain circumstances, as we have in this week's Parsha with Nida and Zav, and when it comes to Tuma of childbirth, separation from spouses and things like that as well. So generally speaking, the Tuma has no practical implications in that, but what is it? What does it really mean? And I think that the question started because one of the ladies asked on Monday, which is the question I sort of expected, which is that we start off the Parsha talking about a woman who gives birth. And a woman who gives birth, the Parsha tells us that she becomes Tameh for a period of 7 days if she has a boy. She's Tameh if she has for a period of 14 days if she has a girl. And then for the period of purity is also doubled afterwards. So for a boy, 7 days of impurity, and then there's a 33-day period of purity afterwards. Regardless of whether there's blood showing or any of that, the blood is considered to be pure, and there's no need for any separations after that for 33 days. When it comes to a girl, 14 days of impurity, 66 days of purity following. And then after that period of 14 and 66, or 3 and 7 and 33, then the woman has to bring a sacrifice. She comes and brings a korban to Hashem, and repurifies, and then move forward for there. What would be the rationale behind why there would be a double impurity for somebody who has a girl versus somebody who has a boy? And that potentially gives some of the rationale behind what potentially will give us the working definition of Tuma and Tahara for the sake of a surface level explanation of a quick Parshas here. And that is that Tuma represents the non-realization of potential. Right? When you have something where there's life in something, so it has the potential of growth and development. When there's an absence of life in something, when life escapes something, so then its potential for growth and development stops, and then after that, that's where Tuma starts. So most they had a baby. Well, so I was going to say, so the class, yes. So the classic example is somebody who dies, right? So somebody who dies is the body becomes tameh because the life spirit goes out and leaves them. Okay, so when a woman gives birth, she had an extra life inside of her, and then as that life leaves her, so then that's where the impurity comes from. And then what would be interesting about that is that when a woman has a girl, so not only is the life that's leaving her, but a life that has the potential to give another life is leaving her. So it's sort of like a double potential that winds up leaving, and so therefore the Tuma is like a double whammy here, right? Not only is life leaving, but also the life that gives more life is also leaving.
I guess
So
in a way, like it's the woman who becomes Tuma, not the baby. Right?
Correct. The woman does, right? Not the baby. That's exactly right. So, I like I said, I hesitate when I give when in giving this shir, because I love to say I understand exactly how all of the spirituality works and all how the Tuma and how doing this affects that way beyond me. So therefore, in this sort of a general sense, when Hashem created the world with the potential for everybody to grow. That's why I say, like, somebody who dies, right, that they're not able to continue to do mitzvahs and continue to grow and elevate and earn more shares in the world to come. We have a prohibition, for example, of doing mitzvahs in a cemetery. Like somebody who's wearing their tzitzis is supposed to tuck their tzitzis in when they're in a cemetery, because we don't taunt people who have died that they're not unable to continue to do mitzvahs and continue to grow. We call that loeg l'rosh, right? Taunting somebody who is unable to speak up for themselves. And so we are careful, right, to be able to make sure that we understand and respect that the potential for growth no longer exists. And so therefore, in circumstances where there's opportunity for growth to take place, and then for whatever reason, it's not a sin issue, and it's not that it's inappropriate. Obviously, having the child is what is the desired outcome. But nevertheless, once the life leaves, then the person who it leaves from experiences that loss. It experiences that spiritual potential of loss. So that's this process, and that's where we start off with Isha Ki Tazria, when she gives birth. So the first couple of mitzvos in the Parsha are those mitzvos. Mitzvah 166 that we've been counting in our 613 mitzvos is this mitzvah to bring the korbanos, bring the sacrifices that a woman brings when she has a baby. And mitzvah 167 is that when she is in a state of impurity, so she cannot eat any sacrificial meats, as we said, that when somebody is in a status of tumah, then the prohibition exists of having of coming in contact with that which is tahor. And it's also and then also to skip 168. No, 166 are the rules of purity and impurity. 168 is the korbanos. 167 is the general prohibition of eating and consuming something which is tahor when you are in a state of tumah. Okay, so that is the beginning of the introduction of the parsha. Should mention that this week's parsha is a double parsha, Tazria and Metzora together. So while the parsha of Tazria starts off and gives us this introduction to childbirth, right, we're going to go all the way through both sections of Tazria and Metzora, which are going to relate to the rules of childbirth. They're going to go into the rules of tsaras, of the spiritual affliction that gets translated loosely in English as leprosy, which because it's a skin affliction, but it's really a spiritual affliction. These two parshas are combined together. There are 54 parshios in the Torah. There are usually somewhere between 50 and 53 weeks in the Jewish calendar where a Shabbos portion can be read. And then it becomes more challenging when there are Yom Tovim that come out on weekends. So, for example, in this year where we had Shabbos, where we lost a couple of Shabboses because they were Pesach, so we had no parsha that was read on those, we've got to catch up. Right? We've got to be able to catch all. The only time that we would wind up having one parsha read per week is, and I looked this up, is it happens when you have a leap year, so that you've got an extra 4 Shabbosim, and Rosh Hashanah falls out on a Thursday. By Rosh Hashanah falling out on a Thursday, so then the Yom Tovim fall out in such a way that you don't wind up with a lot of Shabbos Yom Tovim to lose all of your parshios. So therefore, under those circumstances, it happens, according to ChatGPT. I asked how often that occurs. Once every 13 to 17 years that you actually get a year, and it happened last in 2021, 2022, I think. So it was somewhat recent, where you get a year where there are no double parshios, where it's just everything one parsha at a time, but not this year. This year we're going to have several because we've got not a leap year and we've got a lot of Yom Tovim over weekends and things. So this is our Tazria Metzora is our beginning of them. Now, Tazria Metzora is, I was wondering how long it is as relative as a double parsha, right? When you could combine two of them together. Tazria is actually sort of short, right? It's 67 psukim, and Metzora is 90 psukim. Generally speaking, when we're in Bereshis or so, parsha can be about 140, 150, 160 psukim. So the two of them combined together is not particularly long. But somebody who reads the Bal Koreh, people who read these parshios, told me that this is a very difficult one to be able to read because the words often look the same. Adam Demes, Adam Demos, who and he, they are spelled the exact same way, and that therefore it's difficult to be able to read. And I mentioned this, I guess an interesting phenomenon. The word in the Torah for who and he, meaning he and she, spelled exactly the same way. Hey Vav Aleph. Normally when we spell it in modern Hebrew, he is spelled Hey Yud Aleph and who is spelled Hey Vav Aleph, but in the Torah, they're both spelled identically. And it's also very interesting because if you take a look at the letter Vav, how do we have a silent letter? Where does a silent letter come from? And the vowels of a Vav are kind of interesting in that you put a cholim on the top of it, and it loses the V sound, and it becomes just an O. And if you put the dot in the middle of it, then it loses its Vav sound, it becomes an U. And otherwise, it has a V sound. What sound does the Vav make? How does this all make sense? So I had a Vrit teacher a long time ago, Rabbi Eisenberg, who was I don't exactly know how he was like so involved in, but somehow when Israel was being created, there was some committees that discussed how Hebrew was going to be pronounced and done or whatever, and he was involved even as a grammarian back then. So he used to share some of these sorts of theories that he had and insights. And one of the things that he had shared with us is that the letter Vav is pronounced properly like the Taimanims pronounce it as a W sound. Right, that it's not really a V at all, it's kind of a W. And the reason why we pronounce it as a V is because whether you're part of the Sephardi cultures or part of the Ashkenazi cultures, so you are coming from a country that doesn't pronounce W's, right? So if you're in the German culture, right, Vos is going on, this is your V sound, that your W becomes a V, and also in your Middle Eastern cultures, the W becomes a V sound as well. You don't really have W sounds in either of those cultures, so therefore the V sound turned from a W sound into a V sound. However, when you are, if you're going back authentically and you have a O at the end, so instead of it being you have the cholim at the top, instead of being vo, it would have originally been pronounced as wo, which would have been then changed just to O, because that sounds sort of similar, even if you don't have the W sound in your pronunciation. It might make sense that you would just pronounce the wo as O and your wu as u, because that kind of makes some sense. And therefore it makes some sense why in the Torah the word hu and he is pronounced the same thing, because hu is hey vav aleph, which would be the e and w sound, he, and the vav in the hu would be the hu, hw O, kind of a who, which is then pronounced as who. So therefore you can see how even though the words are spelled the same with the different nekudos, and the vav has this weird pronunciation, how it sort of can all travel. Because the issue with Hebrew is because it's a Lashon HaKodesh, that it is a language that it's not supposed to have exceptions. It follows kind of rules, and when we teach Hebrew, we teach it very phonetically because it's much more consistent. It's not as though you can have like in English where GH could be f, and sometimes you can have a silent K or something like that. In Hebrew, you don't have those kinds of things. So whenever you see something weird like a vav that's pronounced in so many different ways, there should be some kind of explanation behind it. Anyway, since who and he comes up so many times in this parsha, I thought that would be interesting to be able to put in, especially when there's not much I can explain about Saras, which is where we're headed next. In the first Aliyah, we're introduced to the concept of Saras, and when somebody gets some kind of an affliction on the skin, again, it's a spiritual manifestation of a spiritual crime, a physical manifestation of a spiritual crime. So somebody who does something, now generally speaking, we most often affiliate it with improper speech. So somebody speaks Lashon Hara, or lies, or doesn't fulfill vows or oaths, or those kinds of things. Not speaking properly is a spiritual crime, and then it results then having a physical damage on people who are very spiritual. So one of the reasons and explanations why we don't see this affliction nowadays is that unfortunately we sort of don't live that spiritually connected kind of existence where our relationship with Hashem is that close. As you see, we don't have prophecy anymore. We don't have a lot of these spiritual connections. So therefore we are not, our bodies, our physical existence is not as in tune with our spiritual existences. Therefore, even when we commit spiritual crimes, we don't see the physical ramifications of them. But in those days they would have. And so if somebody had done some kind of an Aveira that was a spiritual separation between him and Hashem, there would become some kind of physical manifestation. And the Kohen would be the person that the person would go to, because instead of going to the doctor, which we think, if you're really going to investigate, let's take, for example, if you were slaughtering an animal and you wanted to investigate whether the animal was kosher or wasn't kosher, and you had, some kind of lesion on the lungs, so it would make sense that you could go to a veterinarian, maybe even go to a human doctor and be able to have the lungs looked at and be able to determine whether this lesion on the lung was a serious illness or something like that. It could make sense because you're practically speaking, you're just looking to be able to see what was the physical nature of this wound. Is that something that's going to affect the validity of the animal's slaughter or not? When it comes to tsaras, the entire thing is a spiritual connection. And as we have learned in the past, the entire role, the whole purpose for the Kohen is to build and make that spiritual connection. So the one who makes the determination whether somebody is tahor or is not tahor is the Kohen. And so, regardless of whether the Kohen is a doctor or not a doctor, you can have somebody who's a Talmid Chacham who studies these laws in great detail. Only a Kohen is able to make the pronunciation about whether somebody is tamei or whether somebody is not tamei. One of the reasons why I just never got so into determining I happen to be a Kohen, so I would have otherwise studied just to be able to know. You never know, could start happening again, and us Kohanim, somebody's got to be able to. But I'm colorblind, and so therefore it kind of ruins all the green and the red splotches and the yellow splotches. I would not be able to be able to determine. Although somebody had said to me that potentially that you could have an expert, somebody who would be very knowledgeable in all the afflictions, be able to tell the Kohen whether it's a valid affliction or not, and the Kohen is there to make the pronunciation. I don't know if that's exactly if it works that way, or because ultimately the Kohen's there for the pronunciation, not necessarily for the determination. So I don't know, but I'm just saying that that the Kohen is the one who has to be able to do the investigation. So in this first aliyah, which is really a combination, since it's a double parsha of aliyos normally of Metzora of 1, 2, and 3, we're moving into this tsaras, and we're told that the person who sees this tsaras affliction, the procedure is that he goes to the Kohen and he shows the Kohen this affliction. Now the Kohen can have one of three responses. He could take a look at this and say, this is not an affliction, this is not tsaras, in which case the person is pure and he goes home and everything's fine. Or he can say, take a look at this and say, I definitely know that this is tsaras, in which case the person is impure, and he goes and he becomes isolated for 7 days, and he begins his status of impurity, which will be described in the third aliyah, which we'll discuss. Or he could look at it and say inconclusive. So a person who is inconclusive has to also go through separation. He leaves the camp and he gets separated, or she, and gets separated, but he has to, or she has to come back to the Kohen 7 days later in order to have the affliction checked a second time, in order for it to be determined. If at that point the affliction has gone down, so then the Kohen can say, it's not really an affliction, everything's fine, and you go home and you're fine. And if at that point, even though you were separated for 7 days, if that was determined that the affliction has gone down, you don't have to bring any sacrifices. Or the Kohen could say, still not sure, and put the person back in quarantine a second time. Or the person could say, or the Kohen could say, it's spread, it's really a tsaras, and then you go into a tsaras period at that point. So those are our three potentials, either yes, no, or maybe. And so those are the three potential outcomes of the investigation. The second aliyah tells us about what happens if you can get an affliction or a wound that's on top of a burn, and also what afflictions could look like, the details of what they actually look like if you see a tsaras on somebody's head or on somebody's beard or on the skin. So the details of what they actually look like is in the second aliyah. And so the rules of what happens when somebody is impure are outlined in the second aliyah, and we're told that somebody who has tsaras is not allowed to, he can't manipulate or do anything to the wound. He has to protect it and make sure that he doesn't damage it. Because you might think, well, if you get a little affliction, so just go to the dermatologist and have it removed, and then you don't have to worry about your tsaras anymore. And the pasuk says, do not do that. Not only don't do that, but don't cut any hairs that are on it, because the determination of the hairs and the colors of the hairs can help determine whether it's tsaras or not. So the person who gets tsaras is not supposed to damage this affliction in any sort of a way. In fact, it winds up coming that if somebody, for example, has a mitzvah to do some kind of a cut, for example. Let's say there's somebody who is getting a bris milah, right? They have a bris milah that they have to do, and they have tsaras in that place, so they're wind up with a prohibition against making any cuts or damages to the tsaras. So therefore, you see that it's really a serious thing to be able to stay away and protect the wounds so that they can be investigated by the Kohen. Into the third aliyah, so...
Wouldn't they already, if they had tsaras, wouldn't they have to go to Kohen like they wouldn't be able to then participate in the bris or whatever.
No, because you just remember that's only because you're impure. So the only thing that a person who's tzaras is supposed to be able to do, right? They could be separated, but if they have another mitzvah to do, they don't need you wouldn't necessarily need to have a party and gather everybody around, right? You could have your bris, theoretically. But you don't, so it doesn't matter. So in any event, somebody who is bald is just bald. That doesn't necessarily indicate that there's some kind of wound or blemish, but sometimes that when the skin is revealed, you can notice different inflections or marks, and the Torah in the third Aliyah says that you should have those looked at, and under certain circumstances, they do represent a skin affliction, and that's why the hair is falling out. So sometimes you have to have that looked at. If the third Aliyah continues on, that if somebody does get determined to have tzaras, so then a person has to enter a process of tshuva, recognizing that the affliction is a spiritual affliction, and it's important to be able to recognize that it's a spiritual affliction. It's just not, oh, I guess I'm impure, like many of the other impurities, like a woman in childbirth. Then it's just a waiting time, right? We're just waiting for the impurity to go away so we can return to normal life. Not so when it comes to tzaras. When it comes to tzaras, it's an affliction that was caused, an impurity that was caused by some kind of spiritual challenge, and so therefore it's important that, number one, the person tears his clothing as a sign of mourning. Number two, he lets his hair grow, also a sign of mourning. And he has to make a public announcement. The Kohen announces this person is Tameh. The person also has to be public about announcing that he has done the wrong thing. He has to separate from the camp and moves away on the outside. Why is the separation important for the person who has tzaras? We said some other impurities, somebody goes to a funeral, they don't have to separate from the camp after they become impure. And the reason is because we have to recognize that the interpersonal relationships, the way that one speaks, is often the avera, the spiritual avera, that's causing the tzaras. So it's important to be able to separate from people, re-examine the things that you say, the way that you talk, and give some contemplated privacy, right? You get an opportunity to just remove yourself from all your social circles, think about how you talk and how you interact with people, and that's an appropriate way for the tshuva to be conducted.
Do you know how prevalent it was?
It's a good question.
Like, I wonder if it's super embarrassing. You're one, every few months, or is it this is constantly happening?
There's nothing that tells us how common it was, other than we know that it happened to Miriam.
Yeah.
Right. So we know that it couldn't be. On the one hand, I would say it couldn't be that common because when it happened to Miriam, they weren't exactly sure how to handle it, right? So they put her outside the camp, and then they were like, should we wait? What should we do? And if it had happened to 15 other people, although the other thing is it could have been, because it was Miriam, they weren't sure whether to give her extra respect and wait and those kinds of things. So I don't know, right? I don't know. It's a good question. The end of the third Aliyah tells us that you can also get tzaras on garments, right? Not just on the person themselves, but if you have wool or linen or leather garments, so certain types of the garments could be getting tzaras as well. And the Gemara tells us that this is sort of Hashem. What he does is he kind of gives us warnings. So the afflictions of tzaras start distant from us, and then they get closer and closer. So first somebody might see tzaras on their house, and then that should send a signal. Something is not going on in here, and we've got to analyze how we talk and what's going on in our house. And then if that doesn't help, then you get tzaras on your clothes. At which point you should really get a wake up and say, okay, we didn't fix it. We got to really. And then if that doesn't help, then eventually it goes on you. So Hashem moves that gives you hints increasing in significance and closeness to you to be able to wake you up to be able to do tshuva. Ideally a person, although it's listed in the Parsha the other way around, the Parsha starts off with the afflictions on the person and then goes to clothing, but the Gemara tells us that is the idea, that Hashem then brings the affliction from far away to closer. When it comes to garments, it is a little bit more complicated than when it comes to people, because when it comes to garments, you can cut the section of the garment off that has the tzaras on it. And then if you do that, so then the garment can get, and also the garment can be purified by going to the mikvah, by putting it in the mikvah. You can also have a circumstance where the garment has the piece cut off and then it winds up getting tzaras again. And so it winds up being a couple of extra steps in process, but that is continued into the fourth aliyah. Generally, you always always, when there's a double parsha, the fourth aliyah is the bridge aliyah, right? So you wind up getting the end of the previous parsha and going into the next parsha. And it doesn't, when you have your double parsha, you don't wind up with finishing, Tazria and then starting a new aliyah with Metzora. Tazria Metzora, Parshas Metzora continues on into the fourth aliyah. And the beginning of Parshas Metzora, it starts to tell us about the purification process. Now that we already know what your tzaras is and how you can get tzaras, now how do you purify yourself if you have that? And we're told about the sacrifice, that you have to bring 2 birds. And Rashi comments why birds are important to the process, because birds twitter all the time. And I think that before there was Twitter, maybe we didn't use that as much. But birds chatter all the time. And so therefore a person is supposed to take note of the fact that that's how birds act, that's not how people act. And we have to be more deliberate and thoughtful about the things that we say and how we talk. There's 3 lambs that are brought. There's a process of shaving one's the hair off of one's body and going to the mikvah, and then you bring a large container of oil, which is given to the kohen. First the one of the birds is slaughtered and the blood is mixed in water, and then they dip a cedar branch, a hyssop branch, and the live bird that's left into the water and sprinkle it on the person. And it's interesting to know why a cedar branch and a hyssop branch, because those are 2 very different types of plants. Cedar trees are very tall, very strong, and very inflexible. And so a person versus a hyssop, which is more of like a bush, and I guess it blows around. The Gemara in Maseches Makos tells us that, or is it Sanhedrin? Maseches Sanhedrin, I think. The end of Maseches Sanhedrin tells us it is the Jewish people are compared to reeds, in that despite the fact that cedars are tall and strong, eventually a strong enough wind will come, and the cedar is not a flexible enough tree to be able to withstand those winds, and it will crack and break. On the other hand, a reed is very flexible and bendy, and it can survive in many different types of environments. So even if, no matter what, even though it seems like it's always being blown around, always getting beaten up, it always comes back, and it can always bend with the environment, and then when the wind dies down, it stands itself straight back up again, which is the resilience, a message of the resilience of the Jewish people. And this is also a message about the person who is got tzaras, right? You might think of yourself as being a cedar and all important, and that haughtiness causes you to speak badly or ill of others, or those kind of. But you have to be more like the hyssop. You have to be more humble, a more humble plant like the hyssop, and so therefore the cedar and the hyssop are contrasted in the offering that is sprinkled on the person. So the mitzvos that we have in fourth aliyah, right, defining the purification process, that the person who is getting purified has to shave, he has to go to the mikvah, is 175, and then the completion of the purification process, where the kohen takes the oil from that was given to him by the person who's bringing the sacrifice, puts it on the earlobe, the thumb, the right thumb, and the right toe of the person who has tzaras, which brings up a question in the Gemara: what if the person has no earlobe, or has no thumb, or has no toe? What can happen? And it's a 3-way argument in the Gemara. One opinion says if you don't have an earlobe or a thumb or a toe, then you can never become purified. And another opinion says that, well, when the Torah says that you need a thumb, earlobe, or toe, that just means the location of where it should be. And if you don't have one, then just put it where it would otherwise be, right? If you are missing a thumb, just put the oil there where the thumb would be. And the other opinion says, well, if you don't have a right thumb, put it on your left thumb. And so there's different opinions as to exactly how that process should work. But that is the continuation of that process. Now we get to the fifth aliyah, and we have something very interesting, which is that if you're a poor person, so then you bring a different sacrifice. 3 lambs are apparently very expensive. So if you are poor, you can bring just 1, and you have an alternate sacrifice. And this is very interesting, because one would think that the Avera, right? You did an Avera, you just have to pay for it. That's, crime doesn't pay, and you have got to be able to, whatever it costs in order to get your atonement, you got to take care of it. But Hashem recognizes that the cost, that tshuva is an individualized process, and that's kind of the message that this is sending to us. Tshuva is an individualized process, and if somebody has the money, so then they should use that money in order to achieve that atonement. But if somebody doesn't have the money, so then their atonement is still accepted, and it's not a matter of what you have, but how it's used in order to be able to be brought in the service of Hashem. So there's sort of that kind of an interesting message brought in the Parsha as somebody who has tzaras, that somebody who's poor can bring a different sacrifice in order to get his atonement. Then we move into the sixth aliyah, and the sixth aliyah is something very interesting, which is the tzaras that can happen on houses. And only in Eretz Yisrael. This only applies to houses in Eretz Yisrael. And what they would do is that when a affliction would come out on the walls of a house, so they would have a process where they would scrape the walls off, clean it to be able to see if it was something that could go away, and if it comes back, then the house could be declared tamei. And it's very interesting, since we said that the person or the clothing or the house is not impure until the Kohen declares it impure. It's before the Kohen goes into the house in order to check the tzaras. The first thing they do is they say, take everything out of the house. Because anything that's in the house, if it's declared impure, is going to become impure as well. By taking everything out of the house, you actually save everything from becoming impure, which is really interesting because the tzaras is there. And this reiterates the fact that it's not the tzaras that makes things impure, but it's the Kohen's declaration that makes things impure. And so to think about what that means about our spiritual relationship, it's not just the events that happen to us, but the way we respond to events that makes all the difference. I say to people, like, when you have an attitude of gamzu latova, or difficult things happen to you in your life, one can take a look and say, well, these are terrible situations and bad things that are happening to me, and so it's unfair, or, life happens, and that's not, nothing I can do to control it. And Hashem is making the statement here, it's not what happens to you, but how you respond that matters. So the Kohen, the affliction, the tzaras that occurs, that happens, but that's not what's really relevant and important. The way the Kohen responds and what he declares is what makes it important. So therefore, the Kohen doesn't go into the house until everything is cleared out. Eventually, the Kohen does go out and clear it out. First, you will try to clean it, then you try to remove the stones, and eventually, if it still keeps coming back, the house has to be demolished, which the Medrash tells us that the people who lived in Eretz Yisrael, the 7 nations that were in Eretz Yisrael, were hiding their treasures in the walls of their houses. And so when Bnei Yisrael came into Eretz Yisrael, and their houses got afflicted with tzaras, and their houses had to be demolished, that was the way that Bnei Yisrael found many of the treasures that were being hidden by the previous nations. And I find that to be kind of a very interesting medrash, a lot that could be talked about there, because consider that essentially they're getting their reward, all of their money, from the Aveira that they did by talking Lashon Hara and getting your house afflicted by tzaras. Now your house has to get knocked down, and in the end you get a big treasure. And we have to think about this in sort of the way that Hashem runs the world, that there's, first of all, there's a plan all the way from the beginning, right? Ultimately, Hashem knows that there was treasure in this house all along. The person who was in that house had absolutely no idea. And this is probably the biggest tragedy for him, as he realizes that he's got this affliction, and now he's got to do tshuva, and he has to destroy his house, and he's very sad about it. And then eventually he does his tshuva, and then he knocks his house down and discovers this massive treasure that then can help him, and he actually has more financially than he had from before. But
Enough for 3 lambs.
yeah, at least enough for 3 lambs. So the significance of that, first of all, is a certain amount of trust in Hashem, that the plan is always that if you go through and you follow the way that Hashem through the plan, even though things look bleak as you're following them along, if you can maintain if you can keep the process going properly, so that ultimately things do work out properly. Hashem does have a plan for the end, and it does have that. But also to recognize that while a person gets punished for the averos that they do, there is a greater reward for the tshuva that one does. So at the moment that the person who had the avera, they have the punishment of having to knock their house down. But at the moment that they do tshuva, there's a greater reward that's waiting and available for somebody that does tshuva. And so this is sort of either symbolized in practice or in theory by this medrash, that the houses get knocked down and then they would find the treasures. Yeah.
Didn't the house get knocked down because they didn't do the tshuva?
They got knocked down. Right. Well, the house getting knocked down is part of the tshuva.
Oh.
Right? Because that's I have to abandon the house, and a recognition that my physical things are not as important, my spiritual relationships perhaps, and therefore the house getting knocked down. I think the house getting knocked down is probably part of the tshuva process. That's my thinking on it.
If you had done tshuva before, then your house would not have been knocked down.
Correct,
And
yes.
you wouldn't have gotten the treasure for doing the tshuva first.
Yes. So I have to, that's why I have to explain it my way, because you're right. Okay, so then we move into, continuing on in this sixth aliyah, we have a new type of tumah that gets raised and brought up. It's the tumah of zav. Tumah zav happens to men if they have an emission. It's not a regular, typical seminal emission, but a more of like a diseased emission. So if it happens one time, they become impure for a single day, and if it happens twice, then they become impure for a week. And if it happens the third time, they're impure for a week and have to bring sacrifices as well. And the details of that are brought out at the end of the sixth aliyah. So in the mitzvos that we have, number 177 is the mitzvah of detailing the tzaras of houses. The zav impurity laws are 178, and then the offering that the zav brings at the end of his purification. And we move into the seventh aliyah, where a regular man who has a regular seminal emission, he has a status of being impure for a single day. And then we have the laws of nida. The laws of nida, that if a woman sees blood during her menstrual cycle, so then she is impure as well for a period of 7 days. Now, it's interesting because then we go into from the laws of nida to the laws of azava, which is a woman who also sees blood, but her period of impurity is that she has to be able to see, keeps again, if she sees only for 1 day, so then she has to have a clean day with no blood opposite the 1 day that she sees blood. And then if she sees blood on 2 days, she still winds up only having to wait 1 day. If she sees blood on 3 consecutive days, then she becomes a zava. Then she has to wait till there's no more bleeding, and then she has to count 7 clean days after that in order to bring sacrifices for becoming a zava. And that sounds more familiar because that's how we treat nida nowadays. In the Torah, there is no need for a nida to wait 7 clean days, right? The period of tumah for a nida is only 7 days from the onset of nida. The holy women of the rabbinical era decided that in this week's parsha we've got many different types of tumah that occur in many very similar different ways, right? We've got the impurity of childbirth blood. We've got the impurity of nida blood. We have the impurity of zava blood. And the details of how all of those countings are done and how that blood is determined can be kind of complicated. Therefore, the practice in modern times became to treat all blood in the most strict way constantly. So therefore, when a woman sees any blood, it's presumed to be nida blood, and the separation from the husband occurs. And you treat it like zava blood in that she is not able to go to the mikvah until she sees 7 clean days, like zava blood. And when it comes to childbirth, even though the Torah tells us that after 7 days for a boy or 14 days for a girl, the next blood that's seen for the next 33 days or 66 days is pure, we don't in practice keep that. And as long as there's blood being shown, the woman stays in the status of nida continuing. And that is all, even though you read the parsha and you say, well, wait a second, I'm reading these laws, I read the things in the Torah, and that doesn't seem to be in practice what we're doing. That's because what we have done in practice in modern times is we've taken all of the different tumas, sort of combined them all together, and always applying the most strict approach on any of the types of blood that we see. So therefore, whatever it is, we treat it sort of in the strict sense in the modern times. And those are rabbinic rules and enactments, which means that in practice, in certain circumstances, there can be leniencies, and therefore on shilas of nida and shilas of bleeding and impurities and things, always questions should be asked, because they wind up, sometimes you can get surprised by where the leniencies can be found. So those are always things to be able to check on. Then the pasuk ends, the parsha ends with just a reminder that we are always, that all of this is, the whole goal is to continue to personally pursue a spiritual, pure kind of a lifestyle. And that ends our parsha with those mitzvos, the mitzvahs of the ritual impurity from normal emissions, the laws of nida, the laws of azava, and the requirement to bring a korban after somebody's azava. And that's our parsha. Okay.